Ohio has become a hotspot for data center development. These massive facilities are being proposed across the state, mainly in rural communities, and the response from residents has been anything but quiet. Communities are grappling with questions about water use, pollution, land prices, and who ultimately benefits from these projects. At the same time, state regulators are considering easing rules for the wastewater data centers discharge, raising more environmental concerns. Zaria Johnson reports on the environment for IdeaStream Public Media in Cleveland, and she's been closely following the data center debate in Ohio. This is part of a series of interviews with reporters covering data centers around the Great Lakes. I'm Rob Green. Welcome to Freshwater People. Zaria, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
To start off, how significant is Ohio in the national data center boom? How does it compare to other states?
Yeah, so right now, Ohio is ranking fifth nationally for the number of data centers we have here. We have just over 200 data centers currently up and running according to Data Center Map. They have global data center mapping data, and we're at 201 right now. And there are more projects proposed, underway, currently in development. But at least when it comes to project up and running, we have 200.
What's driving the interest? Why are developers so focused on Ohio right now?
Yeah, it's partially access to things like large parcels of land, resources. When we think of things like water, land, especially electricity capacity, there are parts of rural Ohio primarily that developers are looking to because that's where they can access those things. But in talking to experts and conducting these interviews for different stories, another piece of the puzzle is that developers can think that these rural communities might not have the political will or the time or the capacity to organize and push back on these projects. So it might give them an avenue to sort of get these projects underway in a way that will be easier than somewhere like Cleveland or a more urban environment.
And what has the state done to try to attract these developments?
So there are certain incentives for developers that come to Ohio to implement these data center projects. There could be tax incentives for developers. There could also be um, agreements between utility providers like public water systems to provide certain amounts of water if they have an excess in capacity for those development projects. But even so, there's still a great amount of pushback from community members across the state, regardless of what incentives might have brought the developer there. Community members are attending meetings, board meetings, council meetings to make sure that their voices are heard if they're against these projects in particular.
Can you walk me through how the wastewater permits work and what are the proposed changes and what would those changes allow?
Yeah, so the permits basically outline the amount of wastewater that any sort of industry or utility is allowed to discharge directly into streams that could lead to Lake Erie or the Cuyahoga River. It basically outlines a cap on the total amount of wastewater that they're allowed to discharge. And so the proposed changes at the Ohio EPA is to increase the amount of wastewater that data centers in particular are allowed to discharge. And from a regulatory standpoint, the argument is that this would make the permitting process easier for developers so that they can sort of fast track the process and getting their permits approved. But environmental advocates are saying that this is basically threatening water quality and the protection of water quality here in Ohio, especially when we think about the Cuyahoga River, its history, Lake Erie's history of pollution, industrial pollution in particular. There's a big concern there.
It sounds like government officials have more enthusiasm for data centers than the people who would be living next door to them. And in a lot of cases, the developers, as you mentioned, are trying to locate data centers in small rural communities. Why are those areas so attractive to them?
Yeah. So as I mentioned, the access to land is a big motivating factor. I'm based in Cleveland. We have small data centers in Cleveland, but when it comes to these big mega site hyperscaler projects, they need acres on acres on acres of land. And there are in these rural communities, productive farmland, decommissioned farmland, hundreds of acres that these developers can purchase, acquire, and then build their data centers on. So that's a big chunk of it. Another piece of the puzzle, though, is that the expectation from developers is that these farmers in these rural towns are spending so much time doing the hard work of farming that they might not be able to make it out to a board meeting, make it out to a council meeting. And again, that pushback piece might not be possible. But here in Ohio, we're definitely seeing the opposite. I've been to these rural townships where these projects are proposed or these projects are moving forward. And these small, board meeting rooms, council meeting rooms are at capacity, over capacity, with people who are taking the time to let their elected officials know they're against these projects. So even though the developer may think that there's no political will in these communities, there definitely seems to be here in Ohio.
Yeah, it seems like the developers have kind of bet that communities won't have the will or the wherewithal to put up much of a fight, but they're losing that bet. What sorts of concerns are people raising at these meetings?
Yeah, the biggest are some of the key environmental concerns. What does this look like for our water quality here in Ohio? What does this look like for our electricity rates here at home? What does this mean for the amount of farmland that we have here in the state to actually produce crops? That's been a big thing that's come up with residents, especially with tariff conversations happening here in the country. If we're going to be using a lot of this farmland to put industry on, then we're going to have to spend more money bringing crops in. But obviously, a couple big concerns are noise pollution and light pollution from these data centers as well. There are residents, especially in Southwest Ohio, who are nearby Virginia, and they're hearing these stories of, data center projects happening elsewhere in the country and the effects of noise pollution and light pollution coming from residents there. And the concern is, how can we protect ourselves from all of these sort of environmental concerns here in Ohio?
Are data centers affecting land prices for farmers, or is there a concern that they could?
I think the concern what I've run into with my reporting is less so the concern over land prices overall, but there has been an issue, especially in Lorain County, in New Russia Township, where residents have tried to acquire farmland that goes up for bid, and it's so quickly purchased by these data center development companies before they can either um, you know, get their money together or get a group of community members together to put up a big enough portion of money to acquire that land or um, purchase it on their own. These developers are sort of, from what residents are telling me, developers are coming into these auctioning websites, buying up, again, those hundreds and hundreds of acres of property before residents can even get their hands on it.
Something else you've touched on is that outside of environmental issues and economic concerns, people seem to be worried that just the character of their small towns will change if the data centers are built. Can you tell me more about that side of things?
Yeah. So when going to these rural communities where these projects are proposed, residents are telling me if we wanted to live in an urban industrial community, we would have moved to Cleveland, we would have moved to Columbus, we would have moved to a city where that already exists. And that is what the culture of the community is. They're saying that we've moved here or we've built our families here for generations because we like the quiet, rural environment and that we want that to be preserved because that's what we live here for. And so a big major concern is if we encourage development as a state in these rural townships and we are continuing to allow this development to happen, especially we're seeing this data center boom across the state, but also primarily here in Ohio, then where will this rural kind of vibe go? Where will that be preserved if these developments are targeting these rural communities?
Given those concerns, maybe outside of making their voices heard at meetings, how are communities pushing back on these data centers?
Oh, yeah. So there's the meetings piece of it. There are also plenty of Facebook groups targeting different, I guess, corners of Ohio. There's one in Southwest Ohio, one in Northeast Ohio. There's township specific Facebook groups, again, trying to organize people, get people together to show up to those meetings. But there are also plenty of other steps that communities are taking at a larger scale. We've seen short-term moratoriums to sort of pause these data center projects. They could be a year long, 9 months long, and often it's to give both residents and elected officials an opportunity to really study and kind of figure out what the pros and cons of a data center project might be. Separately of that, we've also seen efforts to outright ban data centers overall. There's actually a constitutional amendment proposed here in Ohio to get on the ballot in November, a full ban on large scale, again, those hyperscaler data center projects. And they need a bunch of signatures, but it's cleared the first couple hurdles in the process so far.
What about at the state level? It seems like state officials were encouraging data center development for a time. Now that they're seeing the public reaction, has there been a change in the state government's attitude?
I think it might be too early to say if there's been a change in the state government's attitude overall, especially when we think about the different, like the governor's opinion on data centers versus the attorney general's opinion on data centers. I think what will really tell is whether or not this constitutional amendment that they're trying to get on the ballot, that residents, organizers are trying to get on the ballot in November. If that receives any pushback from the state, that might be a good indicator, but it's too soon to tell it right now if the state's tune is changing. But what is clear, at least to me in my reporting, is that residents are continuing to learn more from other communities and they're continuing to push back more. So it would be interesting to see how the state responds to that.
I want to ask you about Lorain County because the story there seems to really be kind of emblematic of how this conflict is unfolding throughout the state and even outside of Ohio. It set the stage for me. What's the historical backdrop for the data center debate in Lorain County?
Yeah, so Lorain County, primarily in New Russia Township, that's the township where this specific project is proposed. But the western side of Lorain County, where the township is one of those historically rural communities. People move there, people have lived there because of the rural environment. And so when it comes to this data center project in particular, it's one of many that residents say have been. One of many industrial projects, I should say, that residents told me have been proposed by the city. And it's not fully clear yet whether it'll be a data center particularly. The city and the developer itself, they're calling, or like I should say, the county and developers are calling it a mega site project. Basically, it could be any sort of large scale industrial project. And a data center is one of many potential end users that could be identified for the site. But residents say that different development projects over time that have been picked up and put down by the county, started and not completed by the county, has led to an overall feeling of distrust. So even though they may say that they don't want a data center there, county officials may say that they don't want a data center there, residents are concerned that that's what they'll get at the end of the day. And so that's what led to a lot of the early pushback from New Russia Township residents. That's what sort of motivated residents in surrounding townships in the western part of the county to join forces with New Russia Township in pushing back against this project. The concern is development overall, for sure. Again, taking away from that rural community, that rural feel, but a data center in particular, when residents aren't sure if that's what it'll be, but that's their major concern at this point.
It wasn't too long ago that Lorain County was hoping for an Intel chip manufacturing facility. Was that received more favorably by residents, or were they really opposed? Have they been opposed to all of these economic development ventures?
I think residents are opposed to development overall. From what I've learned talking to residents is that they would prefer to keep the county as rural as possible, the western part of the county in particular as rural as possible. However, when it comes to the data center piece of it, it's the environmental impacts plus the questions around what it means for job creation. I think if the Intel plant were on the table again today, for example, maybe if it was the Intel plant versus a data center, if there was evidence that the Intel plant would provide more jobs, more money, more economic benefit to the community without maybe an environmental concern piece, residents could be on board. But I think they'd still be a bit upset about the lack of rural preservation. The data center I think for residents comes with too many unknown and unanswered questions for them to feel comfortable moving forward with at this point.
Yeah, more of an upside on the chip manufacturing, where data centers are looking like more downside to them. Well,
Right.
zooming out, what do you think Ohio can tell us about the broader national debate around data centers?
I think Ohio is a good example of the power of community engagement. A lot of residents I talked to in Lorain County said that they didn't even know many of their neighbors until they sort of joined forces and started communicating and sharing information and talking to each other about meetings and meeting times and meeting dates to push back on this project. And like I mentioned, data center developers may think that these communities don't have the time or the power or whatever it may be to organize, but they most certainly do, and they have been across the state. And there have been certain communities in Ohio where they're bringing in third parties to sort of educate the community about the pros and cons of data centers. And, you know, have these conversations about what it would mean to have a data center here, regardless of whether or not the project goes through. And I think that it could be a learning lesson for other states or other communities considering bringing this development to their states and their communities. There will likely be pushback, but Ohio has a couple good examples of how to handle it in order to make it maybe more palatable, more understandable to their constituents.
Well, Zaria, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
You can find Zaria's reporting at ideastream.org. We'll put some links in the description and show notes. And for more stories from around the Great Lakes, visit greatlakesnow.org.